In 1999, Dasra began as a venture philanthropy fund to support early-stage nonprofits. In the 25 years since, Dasra has championed social change and equity for vulnerable communities across India. Today, we bring you a conversation from Dasra Philanthropy Week in New York that took place in September 2024. In conversation with Deval Sanghavi are Akruti Desai from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Boris Siperstein, a global council member of Dasra, and Anannya Chakrabarty from Dasra.
Good morning. How has the day been going? Anannya and I have been with Dasra for more than 8 years now, and almost everything that I know about the development sector comes from my being here. So I'm really, really excited to be on this panel and in this conversation because it's very, very close to all of our hearts. I have with me Boris, who is a very tenured global council member of Dasra, Akruti, who is at the Philanthropy Partnerships team at the Gates Foundation, and Deval, who I hopefully don't need to introduce in this room, but he's the co-founder of Dasra. And yes, we are 25 years old now. And this year has been a combination of reflections on lessons from the last 25 years, but also a lot of hope for the future and what it stands for us. The pursuit of equity can be extremely complex, and it's a long-term endeavor. And we really, really hope that we'll be able to reflect on this panel on how that journey has been and how equity can help us kind of be the guiding force to drive social change. I think first, Akruti, I'll come to you. There's a very, very special reason why we have you on this panel. She has been a fellow with Dasra back in the day, and it was lovely to have her. But since then, you have had a wide experience and of the philanthropic shifts and have also worked extensively in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you could start us off a little bit with, the perspective and how you have seen shifts from where you started and how things have moved over the last years.
Thank you so much, Anannya, and thank you for the whole Dasra team for putting this together, probably mostly from afar, which is very difficult to do. In 2009, when I joined Dasra as a fellow, I was a disaffected financial consultant. This might sound familiar to Deval and Neera, who was just looking to make some impact. And I found myself in Bombay, found myself connected to Deval and Neera, and that began my career in philanthropy. I think back then, Dasra was a team of about 10 people or so. We worked out of an auntie's bungalow near Car Subway. Had to take our shoes off because it was her home. And to see, what Dasra has become is truly special to watch, having been there from the start. So Dasra was my introduction to philanthropy. And I think I might have even been reading Philanthrocapitalism, the book that came out in, I think, 2008 on the plane ride from the US to India. And at that time, there was a lot of conversation about how do we apply business models to philanthropy, a very technocratic approach. That was kind of the mainstream aspects of philanthropy at the time. And what I have seen in 15 years, so from Dasra moving to the Clinton Foundation, and now being at the Gates Foundation over the last 8 years, we see this continual shift to now what we're calling trust-based philanthropy, centering equity in our philanthropy, power sharing in philanthropy. And for me, the common thread through all of these different trends in philanthropy is a genuine intent by donors to make impact, and them really trying to figure out what is the best way to do that. So at the Gates Foundation, and I do have to say, before diving into the team I sit on and the Gates Foundation more broadly, there are people and organizations that have been practicing this type of philanthropy for a very long time. It's become more mainstream to talk about it, but there definitely have been leaders. And so this is to say we're all in a journey, and the way that we are thinking about centering equity as one of the largest institutional grant makers is across a few different pillars. So we think about how do we center diversity, equity, inclusion in talent? So in our hiring processes and talent retention, we think about it from leadership accountability perspective, team culture, foundation culture. And last, most important and most relevant, I think, in this conversation is in our partnerships and voice. So how do we show up for our grantee partners? How do we source our grantee partners? How do we ensure that we are finding proximate partners who are closest to the solutions and empower them and provide the support that they need to do the good work?
Boris, you have been with us for such a very long time. Could you just reflect a little bit on the journey that you have seen us go through?
Yeah, the other way of saying you are a tenured, long-standing board member is just to say it's time for you to go, Boris. And so I recognize that yes. So about a year before the 2009 window, I have a Parsi wife. I am traveling to India constantly doing private equity in that time frame, and my wife, who knows Deval and Neera from the time that Deval and Neera were investment banking analysts at Morgan Stanley, she says, "I know these two that went off and started a nonprofit. You're in India. Go meet them and do something with yourself. Save your soul," because I'm doing private equity at the time. So we meet, and we took a very private equity lens to how to do philanthropy. And this is to your point of the maturity that's happened within the organization stemmed from two bright-eyed, bushy-tailed founders coming out of a very elite institution where, and I'm not being insulting to anyone who is in these industries. I was in these industries, but management consulting, banking, private equity, we have the answers, we have the template. All we need to do is go find the organizations and we're just going to apply it, and this is going to work out great. And if you know the statistics of how great these things typically work out in private equity, it's usually one. It's like that unicorn. So the first part of my relationship with Dasra was this belief of Dasra is effectively a private equity manager for goodwill, right? We are looking for people who want to do goodwill. They don't have the resources, capacity, on the ground presence to go do it. We are looking for good organizations that know what they're doing, and we're going to stand in the middle and prescribe the way that this is going to work and match everyone. And that was and is still true. But the maturity that's happened in the organization, and I mean within Dasra, and it's been intentional at the board level, the maturity that has happened is the realization that there isn't a template. There is a vast need for understanding ground realities that no team could ever grasp. And it went from 10 employees to now it's 150 strong. That's the growth of the organization. But the empowerment that we have insisted on within Dasra to make sure that the second tier, the third tier, the fourth tier leadership within the organization is empowered to go make the necessary decisions on the ground at the spots of impact. That is how we have shifted our thinking in what we're looking for in a funding model and in a collaborative model where we are trying to go to the proximate leaders. We are trying to be very intentional about the people we select and what they represent, and sort of building this portfolio that represents what we think is the is the fair, the equitable, the right lens through which to see India. And that's where we are today. In brief, that's basically the maturity model. Now, I've stuck around only because when I was done wearing one hat, we needed to send money across to India, and I have some operational and technical background. And so I just plug myself into anywhere that there's work to do just so I can stick around and be inspired by this team. And I don't say that in a patronizing way. I truly, so private equity is part of my background. I also have had two senior leadership roles in actual nonprofits in the US, unrelated to Dasra. And I have said this, I continue to say, I have never ever experienced a nonprofit organization that brings the quality, the diligence, the rigor that Deval and Neera have basically instilled within Dasra as an approach, whether it's to equity or anything else. The quality of the product that's produced, the quantity of the product that's produced, and the thoroughness of it is like anything that I've seen in the for-profit or nonprofit sector. And so, frankly, the reason I have tried to stick around and hang on to his little beard coattails is because every single year we have developed and matured, and it is really an inspiring place to be as a board member, I'm sure as a staff member, in any capacity. So anyway, that's my story with Dasra.
And Deval, 25 years back, something happened in the city, right? And you were right here, and then you just decided to go back to India. And you started Dasra with Neera, who's also your wife. What were you thinking? Okay, that's not the question. Maybe it is.
By the way, Deval wasn't a great analyst at the time. His decision-making of going in with his wife.
So, on a serious note, Deval, when you started, what was really your vision? And, what were you driving towards? And since then, has the goalpost shifted? How has things moved for you as the founder? How have you seen that?
Yeah, so I think both Neera and I were fortunate to spend time volunteering with NGOs before we met at Morgan Stanley. So Neera worked and volunteered with an organization her mom started, an IIT Kharagpur, working with Adivasi communities, and I had worked with children who lived in and around the streets of Grant Road train station. And so I think both of us had sort of worked briefly with communities. We understood their potential, their inspiration, their resilience, and then just happened to have to pay off college loans and get a job and follow, I guess, what our parents told us to follow, like most immigrant parents tell you to do. But we connected on that front. And so I think, day in and day out when we were working not too far from here, we would talk about, wouldn't it be amazing if we could use some of these skills, but with leaders on the ground in India. And what sort of confused us then and still confuses us now is in the for-profit sector, we fund entrepreneurs, we give them equity, we provide them managerial support, we look at 7 to 10 years for them to achieve some level of success. And in the NGO sector, the same individuals who've created this wealth and invest smartly, they do it dumbly in this sector. And equity is thrown out the window. It's all about, I know the answer, I'm the investor. And so for us, it was like, can we help, in essence, individuals move larger amounts of capital away, but with really focusing on local leaders? And so I'm originally from Houston, Texas, and I know when I was growing up, at least, I was fortunate enough to get exposed to Pratham, which has done amazing work over the years. And I only bring that up is because in my mind, I guess as a high school student volunteering for Pratham activities in Houston, I was like, doesn't India need 1,000 Prathams? And so how do we sort of get there? And so I think that was sort of the basis of our idea of let's just do what, in essence, good banks do, but do it for NGOs, because that was the only skill also we had. I mean, we weren't doctors or lawyers or farmers, so we had actually no other skill but this. But it was always about, to your point, keeping the NGO leader and the community at the center, just like good companies do, and enabling them to grow and scale. So in that sense, I don't think our vision has changed that much. I think the goalpost has changed tremendously. We never imagined we would have the level of people that are here today. We would never imagine that we would have the ability to work with so many inspiring NGO leaders and visit and be part of these communities and to build a Dasra family, which goes well beyond, the hundreds of people who've worked with us, but it's really everyone in this room and outside of this room. So we keep pinching ourselves and are excited to see what comes next.
Thanks, Deval. And Akruti, you have had the chance to kind of see us from outside. But if you could just reflect on a little bit of that, but more on also what potential does Dasra hold?
Yeah, happy to. And thank you for always keeping me in the Dasra family. We joke that I can't get away even if I tried, right? So I will bring it back a little bit to 2009 just to set some context where when I was working as a fellow at Dasra, the kind of primary program they were running was Dasra Social Impact for the leading social entrepreneurs in the country, capacity building, often providing them with skills so that they could speak in a way that might mimic the business world to make those pitches to those types of donors. That was a part of it. But behind the scenes, I know Neera and a few folks were working very hard on what became essentially the first version of this in March 2010, the first Dasra Philanthropy Forum. And the idea was to bring not just the NGO leaders that have been through the program and alumni together, but also donors. And I remember at the time, Neera being incredibly stressed and wondering, what if no one comes? What if nobody shows up? Which clearly is not the problem today, and was not then either. So that was the context of what's this crazy idea of bringing donors and NGOs into the same room, talking about philanthropy, was a fairly novel concept. And fast forward to 6 years after I left Dasra in 2016, when I joined the Gates Foundation, I was very pleasantly surprised to hear that Dasra at that point had already become a grantee of the Philanthropic Partnerships team. And the team that I sit on really focuses on how can we help donors be more informed and intentional in their giving journeys. And they saw the work that Dasra had been doing over the past 6 years with donors to play that bridge between knowing exactly what the needs of the social entrepreneurs and the communities are, as well as what the needs of the donors are, and playing that incredibly important role of intermediary between the two. I still think it's fairly unique. I, not making this up, about 2 weeks ago, had a call about a project in China, and my counterpart in China essentially said, the hard thing is there's not like a Dasra type of organization here that could help us implement this. So this is a model that I think other geographies and regions really could utilize, and could, I think donors see a huge benefit in it as well.
Thanks, Akruti. And Boris, I was wondering if we could just get into a little bit more into the depths of equity, because we know that's very close to your heart. And if we are fast forwarding, I guess, around the time when we had the pandemic and COVID hit, we had to make some very good decisions. And I call them good because they have come out really very strongly for us as an organization. But if you could just delve a little bit on that and that experience, and that led to us having the Rebuild India Fund, but if you could reflect on that as well.
Yeah, well, again, you've stumbled unknowingly onto something of equity being close to my heart, is because my wife was the director of DEI at a large law firm for 8 years. She is now in that space. There was a word intentional that you just heard, and part of that, the maturity that I talked about, is we as a board, and I'll speak just for a second about Dasra and then Rebuild. As a board, we recognize that there had to be intentionality. And this speaks to Deval and Neera have this great idea. They go get 10 people, that's manageable. When you are growing to a larger size organization, there had to be a moment where at the board level, we put an intentional lens on them to say, you must be empowering the next generation of leaders. If you fall off a cliff, this organization must go on. COVID hits, everyone can imagine, hopefully, the scale of what that means for a country like India. And there is as audacious and complex a goal as it is simple that comes out of this concept of a Rebuild India Fund. And let me just state, we are blessed to have the Empowerment Foundation, the Target, Tarsadia Foundation as anchors that trusted us to do this. And that's why what I'm about to say was possible. The trust that was placed was, we wanted to fund, and we are in the process of funding, 500 organizations over the course of 5 years with unrestricted giving to let these organizations be these organizations. And the lens that is placed on that is a very intentional equity lens to make sure that, to your point, there are 10 to 12 organizations in India that might be kind of polished enough to, on their own, stand up in front of donors. And then there are thousands that aren't, but are doing great, very specific work and would never get the attention of a donor if not for some collective effort to bring them to the table. And so Rebuild was structured to be very proximate, very geographically dispersed, very intentional on marginalized communities. All these specific lenses that we wanted to have an intentional focus on, because we knew that if there wasn't that structure, it would naturally fall back to the playbook of we have all the answers, just do it this way, and we'll kind of figure it out. So we are at 175 now. This is one of the hats I put on as I help steer the rebuild. But even to that point, structurally, the selection of these organizations is not what we call the joint steering committee that we have as a sort of secondary body. The actual selection is by the leaders that are being funded. So we go to them, we ask them, who are your peers? Who do you respect on the ground? Who should we be looking at? One, it gives us a true answer of here are the players, sort of a pre-screening of, if you will. Two, it, by its definition, gives these leaders reach and impact beyond just their organization, because they are part of something larger and they are helping promote the next generation of these smaller organizations. So, we're intentional internally. We intentionally have structured the funding to reflect that kind of internal lens that we put on Dasra into the funding model that we believe will take it forward. And again, we believe this is a template that any region can do. This approach is the approach that we believe is best. And so that's why we're putting as much of our effort as we have behind it.
Thanks, Boris. And I think I love the fact that you said it has to be intentional in the way we look at it. And as we scale and as we grow, it needs to be much more ingrained in the way and more structurally ingrained. With that, Deval, how do you see the vision for the next 25 years of Dasra? And I think I left the last and the easiest question for Deval, but if you can talk about what you see the next 25 years to be.
I mean, I think to both what Akruti said and Boris said, I think as a sector as a whole, we need to do a far better job focusing on equity and putting the decision back to where it belongs, the communities who are doing the hardest part of lifting themselves out of poverty. And all of us, whether we're intermediaries or NGOs or donors, we're just lucky to be on that ride. But it's really having them have that voice, allowing them to sort of make those decisions. So I guess in a couple of areas, like Akruti said, we had a fellows program for many years, and back then, because like Tak said earlier, being sort of nice Gujarati tightwads, which I also am, from a funding perspective, we're like, we'll do a fellows program and get individuals like Akruti or Neera Shroff or so many others who are Indian Americans who spent a few years working in banking, coming to India, working for free with us for some time, and then going back. And that was our fellows model. So we had lots of NRIs come, and it was great. And they were very, very critical in our growth. But just this year, a group within Dasra have created a new fellows model where this year we went to minority institutions across Mumbai. We brought on 7 amazing leaders from these communities, and they're in our offices today and really saying, look, we need to now Dasra needs to look more and feel more like the communities we serve. And so it's just a very start in that process. We still have a lot to do at a leadership level to ensure these individuals are not just, for example, driving the impact, the investment committee of rebuild, but are driving also decisions that are made at a Dasra level. And so I think from the equity perspective, we need to be more representative of the communities we serve. I think number 2, I think what we've realized was a lot of the things that we have practiced or preached, like Akruti was saying, from the beginning, it hasn't necessarily become a global movement yet. And I think that's why we do these gatherings. That's why we were so fortunate to sponsor 20 NGO leaders from India to be here this full week so they can talk about their experiences. But these voices need to be heard, and they need to be at the table, not the Dasra voice. And so I think that's sort of the second piece. And then the third piece, I mean, like you said, 25 years, hopefully Neera and I will retire by then. And we have such a strong leadership team. You all have met with them. They're the ones who do all of the heavy lifting. And so hopefully you all will be taking the reins, and then we can sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Thank you, Deval. That's absolutely an easy thing to do, taking over what you're doing. Yes, can't even imagine. But I think we have a little bit of time. And so I think miraculously that has happened because you all have been very to the point, and we can open up for a few questions at this point in time.
Hi, Deval. Reaching 25 years, I think, is a huge achievement. If you had to give us a message of, say, 2 things as nonprofits that we should do, and maybe 1 or 2 things that we shouldn't do, which in your journey you have learned, I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, I think one of our biggest mistakes was it took us a decade to believe in ourselves enough to start building a team. So like Akruti said, when she joined in 2009, we were already 10 years old, but we only had 10 people. And one of the reasons were, Neera and I were still not sure if this is going to work out. Are we adding value? It was quite different. The last thing we wanted to do was take money out of the sector. And so it was our board that pushed us to say, look, you're at the helm, take some risks, bring on people, see what you can do. And so I think as NGOs, many times we are burdened by the fact of, should we hire people or not? Should we bet on ourselves? And I think we need to, because honestly, the for-profit sector bets on themselves all the time. And like Boris was saying, maybe one unicorn comes from that. I think we need to be much more sort of not even risk-taking, but just believe in ourselves more, just like the for-profit people do. So I think that's number one. I think number two, like stick with your model and your culture. I think that is the most critical thing you can do. And many times donors or government or other stakeholders will come in and sort of sway you one way or the other. And it's so difficult to pull back from that. And the pain, honestly, it causes your community, yourself, your team. It's just not worth it. And so again, being bold enough to not just believe in yourself and bet on yourself, but also saying, look, I know kind of the answers. And I know the answers because every day I'm speaking to the community and they're telling me what those answers are. So I think those are sort of the two things I would look at. Yeah.
Let me just add one thing. So the board pushed them to do this, but I will put a call to all donors. The only way that happened was we came up with commensurate funding in an unrestricted way, and we said, we trust you. So this trust started long ago, and it was Neera and Deval, don't be penny wise, pound foolish. Go invest in your team. You know what you're doing. You will do well. That can't just be a suggestion. That came with money. And that money enabled them to grow. And that money gave them the confidence to go and empower the next leader. So from a funder standpoint, you must, the 15% myth, whatever it is, whatever the number is right now. And again, I've seen this as a governance partner. I have operated at senior leadership levels of two nonprofits. The mentality cannot be, I'm just looking for a ratio. You have to say, I trust this organization. Just like if you're an investor, I trust you and your business model. Go do it right. Here is the funding to do it. Not just I'm investing in that widget maker and it better go to that widget maker, and forget everything else that you have to have alongside the widget maker. So I will put that plug because he sort of glosses over our board pushed us for it. We did. We also had to come up with the cash to do that. And we did.
Hi, question to Deval again. The culture that I see in your team has been very encouraging. I've been in the sector for 10 years, but I've known Dasra closely only the last year and a half or 2 years. And what really is endearing to see is the kind of respect that is there in your team for the sector, for the people in the sector. And it is rare. Like I said, a decade and a half in the sector in India, there's a lot of condescending tone. There's a lot of telling that happens. And I have not faced that even once in the team at Dasra. And I really wanted to congratulate you and Neera for that. So what did you do right? What do you think went right? And what was that one thing you did, you feel?
Go to the community, see what they deal with, and realize we are nothing. And I think every day one needs to be reminded about that. And we are when we go to the community. And I think that is critical. And I think we're very lucky to have a large team that does that. And so I think it's all of you leaders that allow us to continue that.
And if I could just quickly add to that, I think one thing that I would be remiss not to mention is when we constantly talk about equity and centering equity, it can often be framed as a moral imperative. From my personal perspective, it's an efficiency imperative, right? If you're not close to the communities, you don't know what their solutions are, and you're trying a bunch of things that don't work. So to that point, your team going out to the communities, I'm sure, is very, very helpful, and you all being a very culturally wonderful team, but also very efficient team.
No Cost Extension will be back next time with a brand new episode. For more information on any of the work that Dasra does or any of the guests featured on the show, please go to dasra.org.